If you have to think about your parents, for example, what do you think Canada meant to them or means to them, and what does it mean to you?
A lot of people, when they first hear the word Muslim-Indigenous relationships, they would first ask why. Why is that something that we should focus on?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the second episode of the Lighthouse podcast. My name is Aasif Bulbulia, and I'm joined today by Brother Sa'ad Waqas. In this episode, we will be introducing ourselves, maybe laying some of the groundwork for the podcast, and giving a bit of context to why we felt it was necessary to start this platform to begin with. Sa'ad, you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Yeah, like he said, my name is Sa'ad Waqas. Currently, I am a graduate student in clinical psychology. Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. I'm from Johannesburg, South Africa. I moved to Regina in February this year, so it's been about 5 months. And I am working as a youth and community engagement officer at RYLI Islamic Center, but also in my capacity as a part of the Regina Youth Leadership Institute, which is, the project, like one of the major projects that we're working on currently. So yeah, alhamdulillah. How's your day going?
Good. How's your day going?
It's been good.
Really hot outside.
It is hot, yeah, no, alhamdulillah. I was giving the khutbah at the gym location earlier today, and subhanAllah, there's like an indigenous group that was having there was a ceremony going on outside the masjid, and it was really interesting. It's like as the adhan is going, you can hear the drums beating, and it felt like such like an interesting context to be in, to be listening to the drums and the sound of the adhan, and it just had me thinking a lot about like Muslim-Indigenous relationships and what being in this place might mean.
Yeah, I think, like just interactions in a society between two cultures are always interesting. I don't know if South Africa is like that, where they have multiple religious or cultural minorities.
Yeah, no, so South Africa is a very multicultural environment, lots of diverse peoples and histories, and I think like that plays a big role in shaping even our understanding around what it means to be in community with one another. South Africa's gone through a pretty difficult history, and like a lot of places that have gone through colonial violence, and I think that definitely shapes one's outlook in a big way.
So how has your, outlook in terms of understanding what a community is, has it changed ever since you came to Regina? Has it developed any further?
Yeah, I imagine it's constantly evolving. I think that's the best way to put it. Yeah, the community in Regina, especially the Muslim community, is a relatively young community. I mean, when I think about where I'm coming from, South Africa, the first Muslims arrived in South Africa in the 1600s. And so our communities have had maybe a bit more time to establish the institutions, kind of lay the kinds of foundations that, have kind of gotten us to where we are today. And at the same time, I think that also creates it makes it a little bit more difficult to affect change when it comes to challenging institutional norms or thinking a little bit more creatively around, what those questions of community might mean. And here, I think like what I appreciate about being in Regina is the fact that, there's a willingness to experiment. There's a willingness to be a bit more creative in thinking about, okay, what can we do in community with one another? And I think like that's quite refreshing in its own way, and it's exciting, and it presents a lot of possibilities. That's been one of the big highlights for me.
I think a lot of people, when they first hear the word Muslim-Indigenous relationships, they would first ask why. Why is that something that we should focus on? Why is it so important? So I was wondering if you could give your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, first and foremost, I think part of our being present on this land requires us to think carefully about what responsibilities that comes with. And, as Muslims, when we think about the notion of bearing witness, right, like that's such an integral part of our faith. thinking about bearing witness to the oneness of Allah, bearing witness to the prophethood of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his mission, his message. And, the more one studies the history of how colonialism particularly has impacted, indigenous communities here, even communities abroad, like in South Africa and Palestine, the more one begins to see the connections and to see the ethical challenges that poses. And I think, going back to that question of what are our ethical responsibilities, I believe that we have a particular responsibility to humble ourselves before the indigenous peoples of this land, to pay more careful attention to the histories that have shaped Regina in that respect. I remember, learning that one of the names for this place is like the land of gathered bones, right? Which is like a very haunting name. Like, it's a very haunting way of naming a place. And I think even the notion of naming itself is such a powerful act, and there's a lot of power in who gets to name, what kinds of names we create. And when a place is called the land of gathered bones, that requires a deeper introspection and reflection on okay, why? What is the story behind that? So I think that I don't have a clear-cut answer at this stage, but at least to say that we have a lot to learn, for sure.
Fair enough. That was a very thoughtful answer, I think, in depth. I wonder if you can talk a bit about your journey. Whenever people move to Regina, which I think people say is a very small city, I've been living here for so long, it just feels normal to me now. But whenever people move to Regina, I always ask them, like, hey, how was the transition for you? Yeah. And usually it's people that moved from other parts of Canada or maybe like some part of the States. But moving from South Africa all the way here to Regina, what has the transition been like for you?
Yeah, it's been a big shift for sure. I mean, I didn't know that Regina existed until like January this year. I was contacted by Dr. Muhammad Asadullah, who does a lot of volunteering work here at RYLI, and he basically approached me and he said, there's this job opportunity. Would you be interested in applying? He'd been following some of the work that I was doing back in South Africa, and it just felt aligned with a lot of the things that I was passionate about, and it felt like one of those opportunities that doesn't come around very often. And so after giving it some thought, I said, this is the right move. And so I moved in February this year. It was still winter, I think, when I arrived. It was exceptionally cold. I think I didn't realize it could get that cold anyway. And at the same time, I definitely appreciated the warmth and the hospitality of the community, getting to meet, the people that are doing the best that they can in these spaces, especially young people. I think one of the first things that I did when we arrived was getting to meet, the MSA students, the high school students, people at the university, and I was really inspired by the energy and seeing
I
how
think
passionate
that's the first time we met as well, was at an event like that.
Yeah. Was it not at the policing? There was a policing forum or something like that.
Yeah, it was like a research presentation. Yeah.
But yeah. So how long have you've lived in Regina most of your life?
Somewhat. Originally, I'm from Pakistan. I was born there. My family moved to Winnipeg in 2009. And then we lived in Winnipeg for a few years, and I've been living in Regina since 2013.
How does Winnipeg compare to Regina?
A lot smaller. Regina is a lot smaller, not Winnipeg, no. And you're right. I think even in some of the bigger cities like Winnipeg, the Muslim community, even though it's just still in its infancy, it's still a bit more established, I would say, compared to Regina. And just the city itself, right? You look at the infrastructure, there's just big differences there. The city's just a bit less established. I guess that comes with it being a smaller city.
Yeah. Interesting. Do you see yourself living in Regina in the long term?
I don't know. This is a question I've been asking myself recently, because at least for me, I'm getting to be that age where you're like, okay, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And a big part of that question is choosing where to live. But no, I've had the opportunity to travel over the past year, and I've been to some of the bigger cities like Toronto or Vancouver. And no, I like Regina. I like the size. Like maybe the biggest city I would consider moving to is Calgary or Edmonton, but not any bigger than that. It feels a bit weird like going to Toronto and there's just so many people. I'm just not used to that. Yeah.
Okay. Where were you traveling recently? You just got back.
Yeah. So I went to a conference, the CPA conference, the Canadian Psychological Association conference, and that was in St. John's, Newfoundland. That was a unique place too, I think. It was around the same size as Regina or Saskatoon. But it was like right by the ocean. Essentially, I think it's an island. Yeah.
Nice. How was the conference?
The conference was amazing. I think one of the best things you get to do at any social event or conference is networking and talking to people. Especially because I do live in such a small city, right? It's really easy to just kind of put your blinders on and just ignore whatever else is happening out there. So getting out gives you an opportunity to get like the lay of the land and understand what's happening.
Was there an insight that you gained from the conference that you didn't have before you got there, or that you've been mellowing on and thinking about since you got back?
Yeah, I mean, for those that don't know, I think I mentioned, but I'm doing my graduate master's degree in clinical psychology. So the conference was a psychological conference or a psychology conference. And one thing I realized was just the demand and the shortage of mental health professionals, right? And you see that here as well, but I wasn't sure whether that was like a national thing or maybe it was just in the prairies. But no, one thing I realized is that that is a national demand, national shortage at like a very large scale.
And of the people that you met there, was there anybody that stood out for you as like, you want to build that relationship a little bit more?
I think so. I think, mentorship, at least in my life, has played a huge, huge role in getting to where I am today. And I always value those relationships. So whenever I see people that are maybe a bit more established in their careers or they're at a place where perhaps in the future I want to be, I try forming those relationships and, I try learning from them as much as I can. I think it's a really easy way of not making the mistakes by yourselves. I think a lot of people say that like, hey, you have to make mistakes to learn. You have to fall while learning how to walk. But I think mentorship with people that are more established gives you an opportunity to sort of learn from their mistakes or maybe not make those mistakes yourself.
So can I just ask, like, what drew you to the field of psychology?
Yeah, I think I've had a pretty non-traditional journey to psychology. Initially, when I went to university, I didn't even think of psychology. If I remember correctly, like when I was first year, first day, I was a biochemistry major. And very quickly found out I was like, hey, that is not what I want to do. Right. So now the question is, what do I want to do? Like, this is a choice that will perhaps impact the rest of my life. So what do I do? And my father, he is a computer hardware engineer. And so I was like, okay, maybe I could go into that field. I knew that I didn't want to do engineering, but I was like, okay, maybe I could do computer science. So did computer science, but even that was like, that's not where my main interest was. It was good, like career-wise. I know that there's prospects out there, but like doesn't make you happy, and I think like I'm a big believer in like, hey, if you do what you like, you won't work a day in your life. So I was really looking for that, and just through taking one or two psychology classes, it seemed really interesting. And even back then, it was more about the mentorship I got from people. So talking to people that were in the field, right, and understanding what psychology is. You don't really get that understanding from just taking classes, but understanding what psychology is. So then I was like, okay, I'll do a psychology degree, sure. And then a lot of people, it family members, friends, they were like, hey, just so you know, like um, a psychology undergraduate bachelor's degree won't get you anywhere, right? And then I just went back to like step one, like, okay, well, if it's not going to get me anywhere, what am I doing with my life? So the initial plan was like, hey, I like psychology, so I'll do it. Maybe it doesn't lead to a career, but I like it, I enjoy it, so I'll do it. Alongside, I'll keep my computer science degree going. And that's sort of what I did till the end. I think I decided to graduate from my psychology degree first, and then I have like 6 or 7, like 1 year left in my computer science classes to graduate from that. I was lucky enough to go do a computer science related like internship. And from that, I realized, okay, wow, this is not what I want to do for the rest of my life. So then I started taking psychology a bit more seriously and started pursuing that route.
How do you not let the opinions of other people dissuade you from doing the things that you love and that you feel passionate about?
I think I really try to contextualize where their opinion is coming from, right? If somebody comes and tells me, for example, hey, a psychology degree isn't going to take you anywhere, I think it's really important to understand what context they're speaking from, right? Like what observations they've made. And ultimately, it's about whether the person cares about you. I think that plays a huge role, right? I think understanding that, like, hey, if this person is taking the time out of their day and coming and having this conversation with me, then maybe they're trying to help me. Maybe there is something there. They might not be right, but they have seen something that makes them think that way. So what is that? And then kind of evaluating it that way, right? And is their judgment correct? It might not be, but it also might be.
No, the reason that I'm asking is because in the time that I've been here, I've had a few young people coming up to me and saying, you know, like, I feel passionate about this field, but my parents are trying to encourage me to go in a different direction, or they...
mental health field.
Not just mental health, but I think more generally in terms of, you know, different career paths, and saying that, like, you know, I met one young brother here who was like, I really want to be a soccer player. You know, it's like I enjoy it. I really, like, there's something that I get from being on the field. But naturally, you know, my parents have reservations, and they've got, you know, they don't, like, it's not on the cards really for my family and I. And yeah, it did make me think about, you know, what are the kind of generational influences that we have, and, you know, what impact is the fact that, you know, families having moved here and trying to establish a better life for themselves, how do those factor into the kinds of career aspirations that they want for their children, and for the kinds of paths that they end up carving out. And I don't know, on some level, it seems like there's almost a tension between recognizing that, okay, yeah, there are like real struggles that people are going through, and naturally, like, they'll want to kind of improve their conditions and the situations. And at the same time, it's like you have these kids that have these real passions, and it's like those passions are almost getting sidelined to an extent, and saying, like, you know, like, you're gonna have to make a sacrifice on that. And I don't know, if is that something that you've come across amongst your peers?
Yeah, no, I think that's very common in immigrant families, right? Because if you look at it from the perspective of the parents, they did make a lot of sacrifices, right, to come here. And ultimately, I think it comes down to the Canada that they see, the society that they see, the society which they have had to navigate isn't really the same society that now us growing up in this culture that we have to navigate, right? Like whether that's based on time, like if you think about some of our parents that came here in the early 2000s, culture and the society in general was very, very different back then. And yeah, I don't know, I think it's about perspectives.
So if you have to think about your parents, for example, what do you think Canada meant to them or means to them, and what does it mean to you?
I think coming here, at least for my parents, and I think it's the same story for many of the immigrant families, it was very much like survival mode, right? Like, okay, I got to do this, this to survive. If I don't do that, I won't have money to pay rent or to buy groceries, right? So that was left no time for like hobbies or like, this is what I'm passionate about. Because if you're in that type of a situation, you don't really have the time to chase your passions, right? You gotta go secure finances just so you can pay rent. Whereas for us, like as children, I guess like not really first generation because I'm not born here, but like quasi first generation maybe. But it's a bit different, right? Like growing up, because my parents did all of that, I didn't have to worry about finances, right? It was never really survival mode for me. So I did have that time, right? I had the time to sit down and think about like, hey, whether I want to study computer science or psychology or do this, do that. But yeah, I guess they just didn't have those same opportunities.
Interesting. But yeah, so I thought we might take a moment to talk about the lighthouse and what we're envisioning this podcast to be, because I think it's still something that we're trying to figure out. We haven't fully fleshed out the idea. But I think we also agreed that we need to let it take the life that it's going to take. And there's a journey in that. There's like, it's exciting, you know. The intention was we're going to post these clips like once a month. Because I think we both have other commitments and we're trying to do the best that we can to at least start building the platform from now. Before we begin, like what does a lighthouse evoke for you when you think about a lighthouse?
It's like a grounding landmark, right? Like the center point for people to find it almost. I don't know if that makes sense. Right? In a more traditional sense too, but even in a more metaphorical sense, right? When people are lost and they need to find something. Lighthouse.
We were brainstorming some ideas around like what we want to call it, what's like the idea for the podcast going to be. And I think there was a realization that, you know, we're living in a difficult time, you know, globally, within our communities, on an individual level. I think there's a lot of like real tension that people are feeling. And I think we were trying to meet the need for a space where we can speak about these things honestly, you know, work through our own challenges of like trying to understand what's happening. And at the same time, recognizing that there may be a need for a space where we're able to hopefully create some kind of light, you know, or at least like build a space where we can, when I think about light, I think about like warmth and guidance, or if not guidance, at least like direction, right? And there's an image of a storm, like, you know, when people are stuck at sea and, you know, you feel like you're being swallowed by the waves and, you know, the ocean is so intense. The sight of a lighthouse can bring so much hope. And I think that was part of the intention in saying that we want this to be a space that inspires hope. We want this to be a space that is rooted in care and empathy and love for the person on the other side of the screen. We also want this to be a space that can maybe speak back to some of the more harmful and I think toxic ideas that do tend to circulate sometimes in the podcast environment. I was joking with a friend of mine. I said, "Oh yeah, like I've done the typical like brown boy thing, and you started a podcast." But at the same time, I was like, you know what? It's we're trying to do it with the intention that this might, you know, whoever's listening, if one person benefits, you know, it's all worth it. Because at the end of the day, it's not about the views, it's not about the subscriber count, it's not about all of these things that we tend to use to measure and quantify the success of a thing. It's really it's about the hearts that we're trying to reach and the fact that you know, people are struggling in this moment, and for us to try to model a kind of empathy and willingness to listen to one another, I think is going to be incredibly important. I'm still learning, I think, because this is first time doing these things. I think there was a lot of, you know, there's a lot of learning curves that we're encountering in this process. But alhamdulillah, I think like it's meant to be that way. But yeah, do you have any thoughts so far?
Yeah, I don't know if you remember the first time we talked about this. I don't even think back then it was a podcast. Like we were just so unsure of what it was going to turn into.
Yeah.
But I think immediately what drew me to doing this was the exploration of thoughts, right? The exploration of other people's thoughts. And that kind of leads back to the mentorship things that I was talking about. I know that that's something I do in my own time, just as like a person, and that has helped me tremendously, like an insane amount. And so if I'm able to do that here, right, and other people can benefit from it, even if it's just one person, I think that's very valuable.
Yeah, no, alhamdulillah. I mean, another part of the intention is that we want this to be a space that centers young people's voices and really creates a platform for the youth in Regina, the youth in this community especially, to be heard. And also to be narrators of their own experiences, right? Because there are a lot of narratives that end up circulating in the digital space, especially around Muslim communities, and we hardly ever get to hear the voices of the youth who are often subjected to that narrative development, right? And who's telling their stories, and how do we provide a space for youth to tell their own stories? Yeah, because I think that in this moment, especially when we're thinking about the ways that imperialism kind of shapes so many aspects of our lives, we don't realize like how cultural imperialism especially plays a huge role in affecting our sense of self, affecting our ways of being, our ways of understanding like who we are, even our understanding of the histories that have shaped our families and our communities. And narratives play such a huge role in that, right? And I think that that's also one of the intentions, is that to an extent we want this to be a space for storytelling. We want this to be a space where we're able to share the kinds of experiences that have brought us to Regina, that have brought us to the work that we're trying to do, and also to enjoy ourselves as well. It's not going to be like super serious all the time, I promise. We will try to like make it, find a balance. And at the same time, we also want it to be a space where, yeah, we are challenging ourselves to think a little bit more deeply, knowing that, like, our words carry a lot of weight. And I think, especially in this context, we don't realize that when you set up a podcast, you have a public responsibility, because you are shaping the way that people may see the world, you're shaping the way that they may see themselves, how they may see others. And if we're not careful, we run the risk of causing harm. And so as we move forward, I think part of our intention is to say that we make the sincere dua that anything we say, anything we do in this space is said in trust and is said with care, knowing full well that we are going to be releasing it out into the onto the internet, where all manner of interactions can take place. But at the same time, I think it's about trying to understand our own like ethical commitments. Yeah. I was curious to know from your end, are there any intentions that you'd like to bring into the space when we think about like this podcast that we're setting up?
I think bringing awareness to the narratives and experiences of the youth is tremendously important. You're right. Because essentially that's what makes up a community's culture, right? Experiences of the people within it. Alongside that, just in line with the goals of the Institute, right, I want to focus a bit more perhaps on leadership, right, and what leadership looks like in our community, in this culture.
Maybe I should give some context for people that aren't aware about what RYLI is trying to do. So, as I mentioned, I'm part of an emerging institution called the Regina Youth Leadership Institute. And the purpose of this institute is to really grapple with the question of what is the kind of youth leadership that we need in this moment at this time. And one of the ways that we're trying to do that is through a few programs that we're running currently. So we're busy getting ready for a summer camp that's coming up in August. We've got a youth fellowship program that's happening. We're organizing a mentorship program, inshallah, for high school students and university students, kind of bringing them into conversation with one another. And then inshallah in July, we're going to be heading to Winnipeg to attend the Youth Summit that's going to be taking place. It's going to be hosted by the Islamic Social Services Association. Shout out to Atishaina Siddiqui. And yeah, so I think there's a few programs that we've got lined up over the next few months, and so we've just been putting in the work of trying to get that organized. And I'm so grateful to all of the teams that are working behind the scenes, because it wouldn't be possible without the hard work of so many talented young people in the community, and without the support of like Darulfullah Islamic Center and all of these people that are so invested in this pursuit, because they realize that there's such an urgent need and a critical need. And I think part of the intention as well is to say that, like, as much as we are situated in Regina, and we want this podcast to be like a Regina-based podcast, we want the ideas to also travel, right? And we recognize that, whoever might be watching, there's such a need, right? Especially for thinking about youth leadership in ways that are responsive to our social contexts, that can meet the moment that we're dealing with. And at the same time are able to draw on this rich tradition that we have, right? It's such a dynamic tradition. There's so much depth in terms of concepts and ideas and ways of being and things that we are often like sheltered from. And at the same time, it's also to work on like acknowledging that there are like harmful institutional norms that we need to be addressing, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot that's kind of layered and weaved into that. I think I've dumped a lot there, but yeah, it's a work in progress.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a work in progress, right? I think every time we meet, we like talk about maybe we should do this, maybe we should do that. And speaking of that, I think I'm just thinking of this. No, I've been thinking of this for a minute, but I think another thing that we will focus on is bringing on voices, whether that's leaders or whoever else, voices of people that are outside of the community, yet they work closely with the community. Right? I think those are the voices that are often not heard, right? Like the outsiders voicing their opinions, their experiences about a certain community. That's almost taboo, right? Not talked about very often.
Yeah, no. I mean, while we're on the topic, would you mind commenting on the mental health programs that we're thinking about?
Yeah. So recently, about a month ago, we had Auntie Shahina come here. That was a part of a mental health workshop that Darulfullah hosted. Aside from that, we have a mental health research team. Currently, we're working on a couple different projects. It's quite early stages, so let's see how that pans out. And aside from that, I think we have plans of hosting more workshops or just raising awareness. I think that's the ultimate goal, right? We know very much, we're aware that we're not really in a position, whether that's based on qualifications or education, on a position to really help people, to treat people, right? But the ultimate goal is just to raise awareness. Because I think the mental health discussion within the Muslim community, I don't know if it's like that in the South African community, but it definitely is in the Pakistani community. It's very much a topic that's not talked about at all. It's hidden away and it's almost shunned in the culture, right? So raising awareness about that, I think will go a long way.
Inshallah. And I think like in our context, or I want to say our context, in the South African context, like the discussions around mental health are inseparable from, the real structural problems that, we've inherited in our society. Because when people have been stripped of their land, subjected to centuries of like the most abhorrent colonial violence, racism, told that their self-worth is worthless, basically. And then, capitalism as well being like, the value system that is so deeply institutionalized in our habits, in our ways of being, our ways of seeing the world. There your worth is only measured by the amount of labor that you can produce, right? And your ability to consume. And in that respect, I think as a world system, like capitalism has such a deep impact on all of our societies to an extent. And so, yeah, I think like that's for me, when it comes to the mental health discussion, I'm trying to look at how we can both frame it in terms of how do these world systems impact our sense of who we are and impact our mental states, our spiritual states. And at the same time, bringing in the youth leadership dimension into it as well. I think we've had this conversation, which is to say that we've seen the effects of what happens when leaders, especially in institutions, don't take care of their mental health, right? And where we don't work through what are the things that cause us to become triggered, what are the things that cause us to burn out, what are the things that cause us to lose our cool with people. And when we don't take the time that's needed to cultivate, that inner world, it has such a far-reaching impact, not just on the people that we're working with in these spaces, but beyond that in the broader community. And so I think that's a big part of why we want to prioritize mental health, as much as there are like serious needs that need to be addressed within the community. I think when it comes to like the youth leadership discussion specifically, I think that we are hoping that these sorts of programs can help us at least empower ourselves with the tools and the skills that we need to do that hard internal work.
Yeah, I think there's almost a aspect of like transference there too, right? In terms of like leaders caring about and being aware about their own mental health, then others who are looking towards them, maybe for guidance, maybe for directions, are more likely to follow that. Right? Just making it a norm rather than.
And I mean, when leaders know, when young people know how to set healthy boundaries, for example, right? Like that has an impact as well, because it's like you model for people in saying that like, there's certain things that I'm simply not capable of doing. And my older brother, I've got 3 brothers, and one of my brothers, he says, when you say no to some things, you're saying yes to other things. And so like learning to say no, it's about reminding yourself of what are the things that you are prioritizing in your life, what are the things that you do value, and how are you focusing your attention on those things. Without overburdening the people in your ecosystem, the people in the networks, or in the community rather, beyond their capacities as well.
And I think that modeling has such a great impact, like almost generational impact, I would say.
Inshallah, alhamdulillah. So inshallah, I think the next episode we wanted to do is like we are looking for young people to interview. We've got like a few people that are lined up, and we've got a program that we're working on. But I think the intention and the plan is that, like we said, we want to post this about once a month, and then we'll keep updating the page with like clips and reels. And we really hope that, whoever does watch it, if you find some benefit in it, it was a very casual conversation this time around, just because we're still getting to know one another a little bit more. But I think the more energy and time we dedicate to this space, inshallah, we make sure that it grows and continues to be of benefit to people. And even if nobody watches this, I'm always grateful for your friendship, and thank you for being present with us throughout this whole journey. But Jazakallah Sa'ad, inshallah. I think let's continue to tune in. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Leave a comment in the comments. We are entering our content creator era. So, but Jazakallah khair, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.